The afternoon light in Boise always had a way of softening the edges of everything, even the things that should have cut straight through me. That day, though, nothing felt soft. The air buzzed with celebration, the kind of noise that fills a backyard until every inch is crowded with voices, folding chairs, paper plates, and the steady hum of people who believe they are witnessing a perfect family moment. Sabrina stood in the center of it all like the main character in a movie. 22 years old, hair curled into glossy spirals, a white dress that she had made everyone admire at least twice, smiling with the confidence of someone who expected applause every time she breathed. And she got it. Cheers rose the second my dad led her toward the driveway, his hand proudly guiding her like he was presenting royalty. I stood near the folding table where Linda had arranged cupcakes and graduation napkins. Evan lingered somewhere behind me, trying to stay out of Sabrina's spotlight. I watched Dad gesture for everyone to follow him out front. I already sensed something tightening in my chest. It was the same feeling I'd had for years, the one that showed up whenever the attention tipped too far in one direction. Everyone circled around the driveway. Dad beamed. Then he pulled a key fob from his pocket and clicked it. A silver sedan flashed its lights. The crowd gasped. Sabrina let out a sound that was half laugh, half shriek. She covered her mouth like she had just been handed her entire future on four wheels. Dad hugged her while everyone clapped. The neighbors, the cousins, the co-workers, all of them cheering as if Sabrina had personally solved world peace. I clapped too, slow and quiet. That car probably cost close to $30,000. Dad had been working extra shifts at Northwest Freight Lines for months. I had noticed how tired he looked. It hadn't occurred to me that all those late nights were leading to this moment. When Sabrina finally let go of him, he turned to me. Something in me tensed. There was pride in his posture, but not in his eyes. Not when they shifted toward me. He held a small bagel wrapped in leftover holiday paper. For a split second, I let myself hope there was something meaningful inside. Even a handwritten note would have been enough. Just something that said I mattered too. I took the box. Dad's forced smile flickered, expectant, not affectionate. I peeled the paper and opened the lid. Inside were cleaning supplies. A bottle of all-purpose cleaner, a stack of sponges, a pair of yellow gloves. I stared at them long enough to wonder if this was some kind of joke that would make sense in a second. But it wasn't. Dad nodded as if he had given me something useful. He said I should help around the house more since I was good at it. He said it the same way someone might mention their dog was good at fetching. Matter of fact, detached, like he wasn't talking to his oldest daughter. Sabrina let out a small laugh and quickly covered it with a cough. Evan pressed his lips together, then looked away. Linda shifted beside the dessert table, pretending to adjust a tray that didn't need adjusting. No one stepped closer. No one said anything. The noise of the party kept going behind me, but it might as well have been miles away. The distance between me and my family had never felt wider. I set the box down on the nearest table. My hands were shaking, though I hoped no one noticed. There was nothing left to say, not without unraveling in front of everyone. I grabbed my bag from under the chair and walked toward the side gate. The grass crunched beneath my shoes. The laughter behind me grew louder, and not a single person followed. I had reached the sidewalk when my phone buzzed. Linda's number flashed on the screen. For a moment I considered ignoring it, but something in me needed to hear what she would say. I pressed the call button. Her voice cracked the second she spoke. She asked where I was, said I needed to come back right now, said I was making a scene. I looked at the street ahead of me, the long stretch of road fading into early evening. My fingers tightened around the phone. I felt strangely calm, as if everything inside me had finally settled after years of trying to hold itself together. I told her to pray, told her she had 1 hour left. Then I ended the call before she could answer. I kept walking until the noise of the party became nothing more than a faint ripple behind me. My breath steadied. My heart didn't. I didn't know exactly where I was going, not yet. I just knew I couldn't turn around and walk back into that yard, into that house, into that version of myself that kept shrinking every time someone handed Sabrina the world and handed me the scraps. The sun was dipping toward the rooftops when I stopped at the corner. The gift, the laughter, the look in Dad's eyes. All of it echoed through me like footsteps in an empty hallway. There was something else lurking beneath those moments, something older than a graduation party. a question I had been too afraid to ask. Why had he looked at me like that? Why had he been avoiding my eyes for years? Why did today feel like the final confirmation of something I still didn't understand? I didn't turn back. I just kept moving, letting the air cool my skin while my thoughts churned in slow circles. I told myself I would deal with all of it later. The questions, the ache, the strange certainty that this moment was a kind of ending. But deep down I knew the truth. This wasn't an ending at all. It was the beginning of something I had been running from for a very long time. I kept moving until the corner houses thinned into quieter streets, the kind where sprinklers clicked in steady rhythms and porch lights flickered on even though sunset had barely settled. My legs carried me without asking my permission, and for a while I let them. It felt easier to keep going than to stop and feel everything pressing up behind me, but the farther I walked, the more something old began to stir. Something I had ignored for years because facing it felt too heavy. A wind picked up, brushing past my shoulders as if nudging me back toward the memories I had shut away. I tried to push them aside, but they came anyway, slow and persistent like they always did. They never arrived all at once. They slipped in through cracks. A look here, a whisper there, pieces of a puzzle I had never managed to fit together. The first piece was a day in 2017. I remembered it suddenly, like someone had snapped their fingers. I had come home from work at the diner back then, tired and smelling like onions and grease. I walked past the open living room window and heard Sabrina talking to someone outside. I had assumed it was one of her high school friends, giggling over whatever drama she lived in that week. But there was a sharpness in her voice that made me pause. I stood on the front steps without meaning to. It was only a few seconds, but I heard her say something that made the back of my neck tighten. She said I had ruined something important of Dad's. She said he would never look at me the same once he found out. I brushed it off at the time, chalking it up to Sabrina being dramatic. She had always used my name when she wanted attention. I thought very little of it then. I should have paid more attention. That moment resurfaced now like a warning I had ignored. A car drove past, snapping me out of the memory. I stepped farther onto the sidewalk and kept walking, wrapping my arms around myself, as though the evening chill had suddenly deepened. Another memory pushed forward, this one from 2019. Dad had been off for 2 days, pacing the kitchen with a stack of papers he refused to set down. He looked at me differently that week. His face didn't show anger, but there was a kind of guarded suspicion in his eyes, like he was looking at a stranger who happened to resemble his daughter. Back then I tried to shrug it off. I told myself he was stressed. Northwest Freight Lines had been short-staffed. He was driving more hours than any human should. Maybe he was just tired. Maybe I was imagining it. It was easier to tell myself that than to wonder what I might have done wrong. But I had never done anything wrong, not that I knew of. I followed every rule. I kept my head down. I worked. I cooked. I cleaned. I covered for everyone else. I was the one who made sure bills got paid on time and that Evan had rides when Mom forgot about his after-school shifts. I held everything together while Sabrina floated from one award, one boyfriend, one opportunity to the next. Everyone praised her ambition. They praised my reliability, though they said it with a tone that felt less like admiration and more like relief. I was reliable because they did not have to think about me. I reached a small park where families sometimes walk dogs after dinner. The benches were empty. I sat down on one and leaned forward, elbows on my knees. A street lamp buzzed overhead, the kind of sound that fills silence rather than breaks it. Then another memory surfaced, this time from early 2021. I had just gotten a new job at the community college, something I was proud of for the first time in a long while. I told Dad about it when he got home one night. He nodded, set his keys down, and walked right past me. No congratulations, no smile, no questions. Just a quiet shrug that said my good news meant absolutely nothing. That moment hurt more than I let myself admit. Something inside me cracked that night, though I pretended not to notice. I told myself Dad was tired again, but as the weeks passed, his distance sharpened. He avoided my eyes the way he had just done at the graduation party. He kept conversations with me short, and when he did speak, there was a tightness around his jaw that I had never seen before. One night, I walked into the kitchen unexpectedly, and he froze. He had his phone open on the table. When he saw me, He locked the screen quickly and lifted it away from my line of sight. The motion was small, but unmistakable. It was the kind of motion you make when you don't want someone to see something not meant for them. I told myself not to jump to conclusions. But the truth is, I felt something shift in my stomach. It was a cold, slow slide of dread. I recognize that feeling now. Sitting alone on that park bench, I had felt it many times over the years and ignored it each time. I pushed my palms into my eyes, trying to steady my breathing. The breeze rustled the leaves in the trees above me, but it did nothing to quiet the sounds in my head. I didn't want to think about the whispers, the looks, the subtle glances Sabrina and Dad exchanged whenever I entered a room. I didn't want to think about the way Sabrina smiled at me, thin and sharp, as if she knew something I didn't. But that was the problem. She did know something. She had known it for years. I stayed on the bench until the air grew cooler. A few more memories drifted up. Sabrina laughing at me behind closed doors. Mom telling me not to overreact. Evan shrugging when I asked whether Dad seemed different. The dozens of little signs I had overlooked or convinced myself were harmless. A pattern began to form, one I did not want to face. I stood finally and brushed off my jeans. The neighborhood was quiet. Porch lights cast warm glows across driveways. Kids' bicycles left near garage doors. Flower pots lined neatly along steps. Everything looked peaceful from the outside. It reminded me of how our family looked to others. Solid, functional, proud. No one ever saw the cracks unless they stood close enough to touch them. As I walked again, the pattern sharpened. Sabrina had always been the golden child. That was nothing new. What was new was the timeline. Whispered comments in 2017. Dad's suspicion in 2019. The coldness in 2021. And finally today. The gift that carved a line straight through whatever was left of my relationship with him. None of it was random. None of it happened in isolation. Someone had been laying groundwork for a very long time. A porch light flickered overhead as I passed beneath it. And for a moment the street felt too quiet. I kept walking, slower now, letting the sequence of memories tighten into something that resembled truth. I did not know exactly what Sabrina had done or why. But I no longer believed this was a simple case of favoritism. This was something else, something deeper, something calculated. At the end of the block, I paused, hearing the faint sounds of laughter from another backyard. It reminded me of the moment earlier when Sabrina opened her gift and Dad hugged her like nothing in the world mattered except her success. I remembered the way he refused to meet my eyes. It wasn't disappointment. It wasn't indifference. It was guilt, or fear, or knowledge, something heavy that he carried and tried to hide. I walked again, my steps a little steadier. My chest felt tight, but not from tears. This time, it was something closer to clarity. I had spent years pretending not to see what was right in front of me. Tonight, that was no longer possible. Whatever had started in 2017, whatever had grown in 2019 and matured in 2021, had finally shown its full shape today. And I felt for the first time that the only way to understand it was to go back and follow each thread to where it began. The wind shifted again, and I kept moving forward into the darkening street, letting the memories settle into the questions I knew I could no longer avoid. The streetlights hummed behind me as I walked, and the farther I went, the clearer it became that the pattern I had been unwilling to face stretched far beyond the past few years. It reached into the everyday moments of our family, the ones I used to think were harmless, the ones I brushed off because it felt easier than asking why things always tilted in the same direction. When I think back on my childhood and the years after it, what stands out isn't the warmth of birthdays or holidays. It is the quiet rearranging of priorities that happened slowly enough that none of us named it. It started with Sabrina being the baby of the family. Everything she did was cute or promising or full of potential, at least according to Mom. And Dad eventually took on that belief too. Not at first, but steadily, like water smoothing a stone. I was the oldest. Reliable, that was the word they always chose. They said it with pride. They also said it with relief, though I didn't recognize that tone when I was younger. Reliable meant I did not need attention. Reliable meant I filled the gaps no one else wanted to fill. Reliable meant that when Sabrina needed a ride, or Mom forgot to pack Evan's lunch, or Dad had to pick up a shift at Northwest Freight Lines, I stepped in without being asked. I kept walking through the quiet neighborhood, my breath forming small clouds in the cool evening air. The more I thought about it, the more it felt like our entire household revolved around Sabrina. Even long before she had earned the right to be anyone's center of gravity, she became the sun, and the rest of us adjusted our orbits. There were days when I wondered if she even noticed. Sabrina moved through the house with the confidence of someone who believed the world would bend for her. If she wanted a new outfit for a school dance, Mom drove her to Boise Town Square without thinking twice. If she wanted to join a club that required early morning practices, Dad rearranged his sleep schedule to get her there. If she forgot an assignment or missed a deadline, it became the teacher's fault or the system's fault or my fault for distracting her earlier that week. Meanwhile, the things I needed rarely made it past the doorway of my own thoughts. I learned not to ask. The one time I did, when I needed help signing paperwork for a scholarship at the community college, Mom said she would get to it and then forgot. A week later, she said Sabrina had a presentation and she had been too busy to focus on anything else. I ended up handling it on my own. I sat with that memory for a moment, letting it tighten in my chest, the way it had tightened back then, not because of the paperwork, but because of the way I had smiled and said it was fine, the way I always did. I had made myself easy to ignore. A car approached from behind. I stepped onto the grass to let it pass, then watched its taillights fade into the distance. Maybe that was why no one else questioned Sabrina's rise to the center of everything. They did not notice the shift because I had always compensated for it. I was the quiet one, the steady one, the one who kept things from falling apart. If something slipped, I picked it up. If someone else needed space, I shrank. It became a reflex, not a decision. I thought of Evan then. He had grown up in the same house but in a different reality. He was easygoing, funny, and scattered in the way teenage boys often are. Mom and Dad gave him leniency they had never given me, although not nearly as much blind indulgence as they offered Sabrina. Still, he lived softer than I ever could. When chores fell behind, they looked to me, not to him. When Sabrina needed time or attention, they turned to me to cover whatever they had promised Evan earlier. That imbalance wasn't always heavy. Sometimes it felt manageable, even logical. I was older, and my parents liked to say older daughters were built stronger. But over time, the imbalance became part of the walls, part of the floor, part of the air we breathed. It carried an expectation that never needed to be spoken. I would handle things. Sabrina would shine. Evan would drift along peacefully, and Mom and Dad would focus their energy where they believed it mattered most. I remembered a morning 2 years ago when I had been running late for work at the college. I dashed into the kitchen to grab something quick and found Mom scrambling to find Sabrina's marketing project. It was due that day. Somehow it had become my problem too. I ended up driving across town during my unpaid lunch break to deliver it to Sabrina's classroom. She greeted me with a laugh, like it was all a funny inconvenience. I told her it was fine. I told myself it was fine. Later that night, I cried in the car before going inside. I kept moving down the sidewalk while those memories layered themselves one on top of another. None of them were dramatic on their own. They were small, everyday moments, but the small things add up faster than anyone expects. And when you put them side by side, you start to see the shape of a life you never meant to build. What stood out most was how differently Dad behaved around Sabrina compared to me, even before the tension of recent years. He had always lit up when she entered a room. With me, he softened in a quieter way, gentle but reserved. But as Sabrina grew older, his attention shifted almost entirely to her accomplishments, her plans, her future. If she won a small award, he told everyone. If I got a promotion, he said good job and went back to his paperwork. It wasn't jealousy. It was something closer to erosion, the slow wearing away of being seen. Over time, I became the background. I blended into the tasks and responsibilities and routines, and maybe that would have been fine if something darker had not been happening underneath it all. If Sabrina had simply been the favored child, I might have accepted it. But the way Dad looked at me the past few years suggested something far more complicated. The cool night air made my eyes sting. I wiped them with the heel of my hand and kept walking. The road curved toward the small bridge that crossed the creek behind our neighborhood. I stopped midway and leaned on the railing. Water trickled beneath me in a steady rhythm, and I listened until my shoulders loosened just slightly. I thought about the moment earlier at the party when Dad handed me that box of cleaning supplies. Reliable. That word echoed in my head with every clink of water against stone. Reliable meant predictable. It meant invisible. It meant easy to take advantage of. But now something inside me was shifting. It had been shifting for years, but I had not let myself feel it fully until tonight. Maybe it took seeing the silver sedan and the way Dad had hugged Sabrina like she was the only child he ever had. Maybe it took the way the guests clapped, or how the neighbors smiled, or how Mom pretended not to notice the look on my face. Maybe it took realizing that my family had spent years carving out a place for me, and that place had nothing to do with love and everything to do with obligation. I stood straight again, feeling the weight in my chest settle into something more solid. The past had not been random. It had shaped everything that had happened today. And I felt myself finally acknowledging what I had refused to admit for so long. My family had built an orbit around Sabrina. I had allowed myself to be the gravity holding it all together, and somewhere along the way, long before the gifts and the whispers and the strange coldness from Dad, I had become someone who existed to make their lives easier, not someone they saw for who I truly was. The realization hit with a quiet finality. As I turned away from the creek, I started walking again, my steps steady, the road ahead still dim but no longer shapeless. I could feel the next questions forming even before I reached the end of the bridge. I reached the end of the bridge feeling the weight of the past pressing closer, as if it had been waiting for me to finally turn and face it. The questions forming in my mind followed me all the way down the quiet street that led toward the older part of our neighborhood, the side with wide porches and peeling paint, and neighbors who had lived there long enough to know every family history whether they meant to or not. A porch light flicked on ahead of me, and I recognized the small blue house with the slanted mailbox. That house had belonged to Marjorie Collins for as long as I could remember. She was the neighbor who always waved from her garden, who handed out homemade lemon bars on the 4th of July, who somehow knew when a kid in the neighborhood was going through something even before their own parents figured it out. She had been part of the backdrop of my childhood, steady and observant without ever intruding. Her screen door opened before I even reached the walkway. She stepped onto the porch wrapped in a light cardigan, her gray hair pulled back in a loose knot. She had a way of looking at you that made you slow down, as if running from what you felt was no longer an option. I paused at the foot of her steps, suddenly aware of how red my eyes must have been. She studied me quietly, not unkindly, then motioned for me to come closer. I walked up the steps, feeling something inside me settle just from the familiarity of her presence. She told me she had seen me walk by earlier and wondered if she should call out. Then she asked if I was all right, though her tone made it clear she already knew the answer. I tried to say I was fine, but the words stuck in my throat and came out thin. She nodded softly as if she had expected that too. She leaned against the porch railing, her eyes drifting toward the direction of my parents' house. She hesitated, then said she had wanted to speak to me for a long time, but had not been sure if it was her place. The air shifted around us, not windy, just charged with something old and buried. I asked what she meant. She pressed her lips together for a moment, gathering her thoughts the way people do when they know their words might change something. She said there had been a day years ago when she heard something she was not supposed to hear, a conversation between Sabrina and someone on the sidewalk. I asked when this had happened. She said it must have been around 2017 because she remembered her grandson visiting that summer. I told her to go on. She said she had been watering her marigolds near the fence when she heard Sabrina raise her voice. Not loud, but intense. She was telling the other person that she could not believe I had messed up something important of my father's, and that once he found out what I had done, he would never look at me the same again. Marjorie said she thought it sounded like teenage dramatics and did not think too much of it at the time. But when she remembered it again earlier this year, after seeing how distant my father had become toward me, she felt uneasy. A chill spread across my stomach. That phrase matched exactly the change I had felt from Dad, never looking at me the same. It made me feel suddenly smaller, as though a version of me had been walking around my own house for years while I had no idea someone else had created it. I asked if she remembered who Sabrina had been talking to. She shook her head slowly. A tall young man, maybe, she said. Someone she did not recognize. Then she added that this was not the only thing that had unsettled her. She told me that around 2019, my father had come by her house, asking if she had seen anything unusual in the neighborhood. There had been a small withdrawal from his account that he did not recognize. He had not accused me directly, but asked whether I had borrowed something or picked anything up from her porch that week. She remembered thinking the question felt strange, because nothing in my behavior had ever suggested dishonesty, but he had been troubled, and she had not wanted to pry. Hearing that made my heart tighten. It gave shape to the shift I had seen in him around that time, a suspicion planted by someone else, someone who had everything to gain from turning him against me. I asked Marjorie what made her bring this up now. She sighed in that weary way older people do when they have watched patterns unfold over too many years. She said she had watched how Sabrina spoke about me when she thought no one was listening. She said she had always gotten the sense that Sabrina liked to position herself as the responsible one, the shining one. Even if that meant dimming someone else to make the contrast clearer. She hesitated again, then told me one more thing. She said that 2 or 3 years ago, she saw Sabrina sitting on our porch steps with a folder in her lap, flipping through papers. She could not see what they were, but she remembered Sabrina asking our grandmother on the phone how the family estate was divided in the old will. Marjorie said she did not think much of that moment either, but now it felt connected. The mention of a will struck me like a stone. I felt the memory of that word ripple through the things Sabrina had said over the years, the subtle digs, the smug little smiles when Dad praised her. For the first time I sensed that whatever Sabrina had been doing was not impulsive, but intentional and layered. I asked Marjorie if she remembered anything else. She said only that she had seen my father look weighed down for months at a time, and she had wondered whether something in the family had shifted more deeply than anyone admitted. Her voice softened then. She told me she was sorry for not saying something sooner. She had worried I might dismiss it or think she was intruding. I assured her I did not feel that way. Her words landed with a clarity I had not felt in a long time. She touched my arm gently, the kind of touch that says, I see you even if others do not. I felt my throat tighten unexpectedly. We stood there in silence for a moment, the evening air brushing lightly against my face. I could sense the truth beginning to take shape, though it was still only an outline. After thanking her, I stepped back off the porch. She told me to take care of myself, and I promised I would try. I walked away slowly, feeling heavier and somehow lighter at the same time. The night had deepened, and the stars had begun to show faintly above the rooftops. Every memory I had ignored seemed to shift into place behind me, as though lining up for inspection. Her words repeated in my head with every step. The comment from 2017, Dad's questions in 2019, the conversation about the will, Sabrina positioning herself as the victim, the hero, the inheritor, and all of it woven together so subtly that no one noticed the string pulling the pieces in her favor. By the time I reached the corner, the air felt colder. I tucked my hands into my pockets and started the walk back toward my apartment, the pavement illuminated by long stretches of streetlights. Each light felt like a small checkpoint in a trail that had been hidden from me for years. For the first time I realized I had not imagined any of it. I had not been overly sensitive or dramatic or ungrateful. Something real had been happening in the shadows of my own family, something that had shaped every cold glance from my father and every forced smile from my mother. I kept walking until the neighborhood grew familiar again, my pace slowing as the weight of Marjorie's words settled into a truth I could no longer avoid. I reached my apartment complex with the uneasy sense that the night had not finished with me yet. The stairwell light flickered as I climbed, and for a moment the uncertainty in my chest deepened. I unlocked the door and stepped inside, letting the quiet settle around me. Everything felt too still. The familiar space did nothing to calm the storm inside my mind. I dropped my bag on the chair and walked to the kitchen sink, letting the cold water run over my hands. The shock of it steadied me just long enough for the next wave of memory to break through. Dad standing at the counter 2 years ago, shuffling through papers without noticing me at the door. His shoulders tense, his face drawn, his eyes avoiding mine every time I walked past. I dried my hands and paced the length of my living room. The carpet felt rough beneath my feet. I thought about the way he had pulled back when I handed him a receipt once, as if my fingers had burned him. I remembered him locking his truck whenever I approached, even if he had only stepped inside for a second. At the time, I convinced myself he was distracted, tired from work, overwhelmed. I had given him every excuse I could find because the alternative felt impossible. But now that alternative was the only thing that made sense. I grabbed my keys again and walked back outside. There was no reason to stay in the apartment. My mind was too loud. I followed the sidewalk until I reached the path that led toward my parents' street. I did not go all the way back. I just walked near enough to see the glow of their living room through the trees. The house looked peaceful from where I stood, framed in warm, yellow light. You would never know what had been happening inside it. I sat on the low brick wall that bordered the park across from their block. The night breeze pushed strands of hair across my cheeks. I tucked them behind my ears and stared at the house, thinking about the small signs I had ignored. The password change on his bank account, the way he locked the drawer where he kept his mail, the time he carried a stack of envelopes to the bedroom and closed the door the moment I walked into the hall. His sudden habit of asking where I had been, even when the question made no sense. And the hardest one to remember, the morning he told me he did not want my help with the bills anymore. He had said it casually, but his eyes had flashed with something sharper, suspicion or fear. I had chosen not to name it then. A car rolled into the driveway across the street, jolting me from my thoughts. I stood, needing to move. My feet carried me down the park path toward a row of older houses at the far end of the block. I knew the layout of this neighborhood better than I knew the layout of my own life. Every yard, every mailbox, every porch light carried a memory, some I wished I could forget. As I walked, the pattern in my mind grew clearer. Dad had not just drifted away from me. He had been pulled away. Sabrina had been careful, strategic even. She placed seeds of doubt slowly, quietly, and with each seed, Dad had stepped a little farther back. I turned onto a side street lined with tall oaks. Their branches swayed gently, casting shifting shadows across the pavement. I thought of something I had overheard only a few months ago, a moment I had forgotten until now. Mom had been washing dishes, and Sabrina had been at the kitchen table scrolling through her phone. I walked in to grab a glass of water, and they both fell silent. Sabrina watched me with a smugness she did not bother to hide. Mom hurried to ask about work, but her voice was too bright, too forced. Something had passed between them before I walked in. Something about me. The more I looked back, the more I realized that this tension had not started with one event. It had grown in layers. Sabrina shining just a little brighter each year, my parents leaning into her glow, and me fading in the background until I became easy to cast in whatever role she wanted for her own benefit. I stopped walking when I reached a street lamp with a cracked base. It buzzed in an uneven rhythm, dimming and brightening in soft pulses. I leaned against it, taking a slow breath. I remembered the argument between Sabrina and Mom that I had overheard weeks earlier. Sabrina had said something about me touching a file in 2019, something that would ruin everything if Dad ever found out. Mom had told her to stop, her voice trembling slightly. I had not understood then. I had been too tired to dig into it. But tonight that fragment pressed itself into place beside the other pieces. Whatever Sabrina had done, it tied into my father's fear, his distance, his refusal to meet my eyes. And Mom knew more than she let on. That much was clear. I pushed away from the street lamp and continued walking. A few windows glowed soft gold behind curtains. I passed a mailbox with peeling paint, a bike left on its side in a yard, a sprinkler clicking rhythmically in the next lawn. These were things I had seen countless times. Yet tonight everything felt heavier, sharper, like the world was nudging me toward the truth with every familiar detail. I thought about Dad again, the way he stiffened when I entered a room, the way he seemed to brace himself whenever I spoke. I tried to imagine what it must feel like to believe your own child had betrayed you. If he really thought I had misused his trust, even in small ways, that could explain why he had built a wall between us, but it did not explain why he believed it so easily, why he never asked me directly, why he never gave me a chance to explain, unless someone else had given him explanations first, convincing ones, wrapped in the kind of charm and innocence that Sabrina had mastered from the time she could talk. A group of teenagers walked past on the opposite sidewalk, laughing loudly. I stepped aside to give them room, and as soon as their voices faded, the quiet returned like a blanket settling over my shoulders. The longer I thought about it, the more I realized that Sabrina had been building this version of me since she was a teenager herself. Small stories told to friends, comments whispered to relatives, suggestions slipped into conversations with mom and dad. A narrative that grew stronger every time I backed down, stayed quiet, or picked up the slack. I stopped near a small cul-de-sac, the one where the houses sat close together with tidy shrubs and identical trash bins lined neatly on the curb. I had played here as a kid. I remembered riding my bike around the circle, feeling free for the first time in my life. The memory contrasted sharply with how trapped I felt now. I walked to the center of the circle and stood still. The night around me was silent except for a dog barking in the distance. I looked up at the sky and let out a long, slow breath. Dad had not simply lost faith in me. His trust had been chipped away, deliberately and quietly, and I had been too tangled in the role of caretaker to question any of it. But that role was slipping off my shoulders now, revealing something raw beneath it. A mixture of anger and grief and a strange kind of steadiness that came from finally seeing the truth. I turned and began making my way back toward the main road, my steps slower than before. The pieces were aligning in a way that made my stomach twist. I did not have the full picture yet, but I was closer than I had ever been. By the time the entrance to my apartment complex came into view, my thoughts had settled into a grim clarity. There was only one way to uncover the truth. I had to follow the threads deeper, even if they led me to something I was not ready to face. I reached for my keys, the metal cool against my fingers, and stepped inside my apartment once more, knowing that the next step would pull me closer to whatever had been hiding in the dark corners of my family for far too long. I sat on the edge of my bed for a long moment after closing the apartment door behind me. The quiet pressed in from all sides, thick and heavy, as if the walls themselves were waiting for me to move. I knew sleep was impossible. My mind kept circling the same questions, returning again and again to the pieces that no longer fit together unless I admitted something darker had been happening all along. The only way to get answers was to reach beyond the limits of what I could remember and into the things I had spent years avoiding. I stood, grabbed my bag, and pulled out the old folder where I had kept paperwork from the years when Dad relied on my help. Back then, he trusted me enough to let me sort his emails, save copies of his insurance forms, and keep track of receipts he needed for tax season. I had kept some of those documents out of habit. I thought they might be useful someday, though I could never have predicted this. The folder felt heavier than it should as I set it on the kitchen table. I sifted through it slowly, finding a mixture of bank notices, scanned statements, printouts of account updates from 2018 through 2020. Nothing on its own looked unusual, but I felt something under the surface, a quiet tremor of wrongness I could not quite name. I needed help from someone who understood this world better than I did. My coworker Jenna had once mentioned a local attorney who handled probate and financial issues. I searched my phone until I found the name she had written down for me months ago. At the time, I thought I would never need it. Now it felt like something close to Lifeline. I called the number. A calm voice answered and introduced herself as Rachel Kessler. I explained not everything, only that I had reason to believe some of my father's financial records had been altered and that I still had copies of earlier versions. She paused as if listening between my words. She offered an appointment for the next morning. I slept no more than 2 hours. By the time the sun rose over Boise, I was already in my car, heading across town to her office near the courthouse. The building was quiet, the kind meant for people who needed privacy. I checked in, then waited in a chair that felt too firm for the exhaustion in my body. Rachel stepped into the lobby a few minutes later. She was composed in a way that made everything around her feel more grounded. She invited me into her office, a small room lined with shelves of thick binders and framed certificates. She asked gently what had brought me there. I told her about the distance in my family, about the sudden shift in my father's behavior, about the suggestion from a neighbor that something had been said about me years ago. I did not know how to put the rest into words without sounding irrational, so I told her only that I believed someone close to my father had made him question my integrity, and that the change in him lined up with a period of odd financial activity. She asked if I had anything concrete. I slid the folder across her desk. She began to sort through the papers with practiced efficiency. She paused at one particular page, then at another. She compared signatures, dates, and account numbers. She studied the way the documents had been formatted. She did not speak for several minutes. Finally, she leaned back slightly and told me something was off. The signature that appeared on a 2019 authorization form did not match the signature that appeared on earlier documents I had signed for my own employment records. She tapped the page lightly and said the curve of the letters was different and the pressure inconsistent. She said it did not look like my hand. She checked another file from early 2020. A small withdrawal, no more than $1,500, had been made from one of my father's accounts. The authorization for that transaction had my name typed beneath the digital signature. She compared it to the older forms again, and her expression grew more serious. She asked for permission to trace where the digital authorization originated. I agreed. She typed for a few minutes, clicked through several screens, then told me the access point matched an IP address from a residential location not far from my parents' street. A cold feeling spread across my chest. She looked at me for a moment before continuing. She said that whoever had submitted those authorizations had done so using a device registered near my family home, and that the differences in the signatures were concerning. She said it looked like someone wanted my father to believe I had handled those transactions. I sat frozen in my chair, the truth settling like a weight across my shoulders. It was not proof yet, but it was the closest I had come. She asked if anyone else in my family would have had access to my father's email and bank information. I hesitated, then admitted that Sabrina had always known how to charm Dad into sharing things he probably should have kept to himself. Rachel nodded slowly, as if the pieces were beginning to form a pattern she recognized. She said that forging signatures and misrepresenting identity on financial documents was serious. She also said it was not uncommon in situations where one family member wanted leverage or influence over another. That word made my stomach twist. Influence. Sabrina had always wanted more of it. She asked if I remembered any moment in 2019 or 2020 when I had been blamed for something I did not understand. I told her about the way Dad had questioned me awkwardly about borrowing money, about the strange distance that settled between us after that, about how I never knew what I had done wrong. Rachel asked if I could recall the timing of those moments. I told her the dates as best I could. She checked them against the transaction history from the documents I had brought, and her face tightened. The timing matched almost exactly. She said quietly that this was not coincidence. Someone had manipulated my father into believing I had done something that would justify pulling away from me. This is why his behavior changed. This is why he doubted me. This is why he could not look me in the eye. I swallowed hard. My hands trembled on my lap. The room felt too still. Rachel asked if I had ever confronted Sabrina. I said no. For years I had assumed her pettiness was nothing more than childish rivalry. It had never occurred to me that she could be capable of something like this. But now the conversations I had overheard, the smirks, the comments that never quite made sense, the subtle digs, the self-satisfied expressions, all of them replayed in my head in sharper detail. Rachel reminded me gently that I needed more evidence before confronting my family. She advised me to gather any emails, photos, or other documents I might still have. She said it was important to understand the full scope of what had been done before taking the next step. She walked me to the door and told me to call her as soon as I found anything else. When I stepped outside the office, the sun was bright and the wind carried the smell of morning traffic. But inside me, everything felt dimmer. I walked back to my car in a daze, gripping the handle before finally forcing myself inside. I sat there for a long moment, staring at the steering wheel, replaying Rachel's words. Someone had forged my name. Someone had accessed my father's information. Someone had made him believe I had betrayed him. The timeline was too precise, the motive too clear. A single name rose to the surface of my mind, steady and unmistakable. I turned on the engine, feeling the next step forming with unsettling clarity as I pulled away from the curb. I drove without thinking, following familiar streets until the outlines of my apartment complex came into view. I pulled into my parking spot and sat there for a while with the engine off and the silence thick around me. My hands rested on the steering wheel, but my thoughts were nowhere near the car. Every word Rachel had said kept echoing, circling the same truth in tighter and tighter loops. Someone had done this intentionally. Someone wanted my father to lose trust in me. And there was only one person who had always stood to benefit from that. I stepped out of the car and walked toward my apartment. Halfway up the stairs, I stopped. A figure sat on the step beside my door, elbows on his knees, hood pulled low over his eyes. Evan looked up when he heard me. His expression was tight, almost pale, like someone who had not slept. For a moment we just stared at each other, two pieces of the same fractured family standing under the dim stairwell light. He rose to his feet and shoved his hands into his pockets. He looked smaller than usual, younger. I asked him what he was doing there. He said he needed to talk to me and then glanced past me down the stairs, as if afraid someone might have followed him. We stepped inside the apartment. He hovered near the kitchen counter while I set my keys down. He did not sit. His shoulders were tense. I asked if he wanted water. He shook his head. His hands fidgeted with the hem of his sweatshirt. I waited. He finally let out a breath and said he had seen me leave the graduation party. He said he knew something was wrong, not just tonight, but for a long time. He said he should have said something earlier, but he did not know how. His voice cracked on the last few words. I kept still and let him speak. He told me that Sabrina had not just been the golden child. She had been carefully shaping Dad's opinion of me for years. He said he did not realize the extent of it until tonight, when he saw how deeply the situation had cracked open. He said he had been carrying guilt for too long. I asked him what he meant. He swallowed hard. He said that back in 2019 and 2020, when Dad started locking things up and seemed confused about his accounts, it wasn't because he suddenly became forgetful. It was because he found missing transactions that Sabrina told him I had taken responsibility for. Evan said Sabrina had framed it as me helping Dad with online banking, then blamed me when anything looked off. I told him that matched what Rachel had found. Evan looked at me sharply, surprised I already knew. He took a shaky breath and continued. He said that Sabrina had asked him to do her a favor a couple of times, to watch the hallway while she used Dad's laptop in the kitchen. Evan had been 16. He thought she was working on a scholarship essay or applying for internships. It never occurred to him she would be doing anything harmful. Then one day he walked into the kitchen a little too early and saw her logged into Dad's email. She was deleting a thread of messages. He remembered the subject line and repeated it softly. It was the same subject line Rachel had found connected to one of the forged authorizations. He said Sabrina had snapped at him when she noticed him at the doorway. She slammed the laptop shut. Then she told him to stop snooping. He said he tried to tell Mom afterward, but Sabrina overheard and twisted the story before he could finish. She told Mom he had misunderstood and that he was trying to start trouble. Mom believed her. My stomach sank hearing that. I asked him why he did not tell me sooner. He stared at the floor and shook his head. He said he was scared. Not of Sabrina, exactly, but of the ripple effect it would cause. He said the house always ran smoother when I stayed quiet, and he did not want to be the reason things got worse. He finally sat down at the kitchen table, resting his head in his hands. I sat across from him. The room was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator. He lifted his head and told me something I did not expect. He said that about a year ago he heard Sabrina talking on the phone with someone. She said she had everything under control. She said Dad believed what she needed him to believe. Then she laughed. He remembered that laugh, sharp and pleased with itself. He had asked her what she meant. She told him to mind his own business. He said her face looked different then, harder, like she enjoyed the power of holding something secret. He rubbed his face with both hands. He said that after tonight, after what Dad did at the party, he could not stay silent anymore. He said seeing me walk away felt like watching something break that he should have protected. His voice grew small when he said he was sorry, truly sorry. It sounded like the apology had been waiting years to escape. I nodded, not because it fixed anything, but because I could feel the sincerity in him. Evan had never been malicious, just young, just caught between two worlds he did not understand. He had been raised in a house where the loudest story often became the truth, and he had not yet learned how to push against it. He reached into his pocket then and pulled out his phone. He said he kept something all this time without knowing why. He opened his photo album and found an image. He turned the phone toward me. It was a blurry screenshot from 2020. Sabrina sitting at the dining table with Dad's laptop open, her hand half covering the screen as she turned sharply toward the camera. The timestamp was visible. The email subject line was visible too, the same one connected to the missing transaction. I felt my breath catch. This was not proof of everything, but it was proof of far more than I had before. Proof that she had accessed the account. Proof she had reason to lie about it. Evan said he had taken the photo as a joke originally. He had meant to tease her for being so secretive. She got angry and grabbed his phone then. But he had already backed up the image to his cloud storage days earlier. Without thinking, he forgot it existed until tonight. I stared at the blurry image for a long time, the edges of the truth sharpening like glass inside me. Then I handed his phone back. We sat in silence. Then he asked what I planned to do. I said I did not know yet. But this was the first time I felt something close to direction, something steady. He stood and said he would support whatever came next. When he reached the door, he paused, looked back at me, and said he wished he had been stronger. I told him he was being strong now. He left quietly down the walkway, the stairwell light flickering above him. The apartment felt different after he left. Not lighter, but clearer, as if the fog that had been choking the truth for years had finally begun to lift. I locked the door and leaned against it, closing my eyes. The evidence was no longer scattered memories or vague suspicions. It was taking shape, piece by piece. And for the first time, I knew exactly where I needed to go next. I drove back toward my parents' neighborhood without fully remembering the turns I took. The streetlights blurred past the windshield, and every familiar corner carried the weight of something I had been too afraid to see. When I reached their block, I parked half a house away and sat there for a moment with both hands gripping the steering wheel. My pulse beat hard at the base of my throat. I told myself I was only here to talk, but I knew it would not be the kind of talk families recover from easily. The house looked quiet. Only the living room lamp was on, casting a muted glow across the curtains. I stepped out of the car and walked slowly up the driveway. My shoes felt heavier than they should. When I reached the front door, I hesitated for a breath before knocking. Linda opened it. Her expression shifted when she saw me, relief flickering across her face, before it was quickly replaced by worry. She stepped aside without asking anything and let me in. I walked past her into the living room where Dad sat in his armchair, elbows on his knees, fingers knotted together. He looked older than he had at the party, like whatever energy he had spent celebrating Sabrina had drained out of him in the hours since. He looked up at me and then away just as quickly. The motion was familiar now, a gesture I had grown used to without understanding. I could feel Linda behind me, hesitant, hands wringing lightly as if she was trying to keep herself from interrupting. I stood in the center of the room, waiting for either of them to speak. Neither did. The silence stretched until I finally let out the breath I had been holding. I told them I knew something had been wrong for a long time. I told them I had kept quiet because I thought it was exhaustion or stress. But now I knew it was neither. I said I deserved to understand why they had changed toward me, what they believed I had done, and who had told them so. Dad rubbed his forehead slowly. Linda stepped closer and sat on the edge of the couch, clasping her hands together. Dad said he did not want to talk about the past, his voice low and strained. I asked him whose past he meant, mine or the version someone had given to him. His jaw tightened. He kept looking at the carpet as if searching for something there. Finally, Linda whispered that this was not the way they wanted things to go. She said it had all gotten complicated. That word made something inside me break. Complicated is what people say when they know they have been wrong for a long time, but cannot bring themselves to admit it. I took another breath and said I needed the truth. I said I would not leave until I had it. Linda looked at Dad then, her eyes full of something that felt like apology. He leaned back in his chair, let out a long sigh, and said he had been shown things. He said he did not want to believe them, but it had become too hard not to. His voice caught as he said he had lost confidence in me, and that once that happened it was difficult to act normal. My throat tightened. I asked him what things he had been shown. He avoided my eyes again, and something in my chest twisted at the familiar motion. He said Sabrina had told him I accessed his email once and made a withdrawal without telling him. She had told him I had been careless with information he had trusted me with. She had said she found evidence on his laptop. When I asked what evidence, he said he had seen a screen with my name on a transaction. He had not thought to question how Sabrina had gotten into his account in the first place. Linda finally spoke up. Her voice trembled. She said she never fully believed it, but she could not fight the tension in the house anymore. She said Sabrina had always been delicate, and they thought she needed protecting. She said they assumed I was strong enough to handle a shift in affection. She said she hoped it would blow over. Hearing that sent a coldness through me that went deeper than anger. It was the kind of coldness that comes when you realize someone has mistaken your silence for endless resilience. My voice shook as I asked why no one ever asked me directly if it was true. Linda looked down at her lap. Dad did not answer. I stepped closer, lowering my voice. I told them I had seen evidence of forged signatures, that I had spoken with an attorney, that the IP address connected to the transactions was from near our home. Dad looked up at that, confusion and alarm mixing across his face. I said I had proof someone had been entering his accounts long before I knew anything was wrong. Linda covered her mouth. Dad straightened in his chair, and for a moment I saw something familiar in him, the father I had known before all of this. But the moment passed. He asked who I thought would do something like that. The question felt absurd, but I answered anyway. I asked him if he really believed I would do that to him. He flinched, not physically, but something behind his eyes broke. He shook his head softly and said he had hoped he was wrong, but Sabrina had insisted she was only trying to protect him. I stared at them both, feeling the truth press hard against the edges of the room. I asked if either of them had ever questioned why Sabrina had access to his laptop, or why she was the one discovering all these supposed mistakes. They did not respond. Linda finally whispered that maybe it was time to talk about things honestly. She looked at Dad again, and her voice tightened as she said, he needed to tell me what really happened in 2021. He closed his eyes for a moment, then nodded. He said that 2 years ago, Sabrina came to him in tears. She told him she had found messages implying I was trying to move money without his knowledge. She claimed she had saved him from a financial mistake. She said she did not want to tell him, but she felt she had to. He said she seemed so sincere, so frightened, so concerned for him. He believed her. He said everything he saw afterwards seemed to support what she had told him. Then he looked at me directly for the first time that night. His eyes were tired, heavy with something that resembled regret. He said he did not know how to face me once he thought I had betrayed him. He said that was why he avoided my eyes, why he kept his distance, why he assumed my silence meant guilt. The room felt smaller than it had a moment earlier. My head ached with the weight of his words. I stood there letting the truth settle, each piece falling into place with painful clarity. Everything Sabrina had done, all the small manipulations, all the lies, all the calculated timing of her stories, had built a narrative strong enough to separate a father from his eldest child. Linda wiped her eyes. Dad looked down at his hands. I could feel the exhaustion seep into my bones, the kind that comes when you carry a burden that was never meant to be yours. I told them softly but firmly that I needed to see the so-called evidence Sabrina had shown them. Dad said he did not know where it was now. Sabrina had handled everything. That answer made my chest tighten again. It confirmed more than he realized. I stepped back from the couch, steadying myself. The truth was unfolding faster than I could absorb it. I did not know what the next step looked like, but I knew I had to take it. I walked toward the doorway, pausing with my hand on the frame. The house felt foreign now, as if I had stepped into a place that resembled my childhood home, but no longer held the same meaning. Linda stood slowly, but she did not reach for me. Dad stayed seated, hands motionless, eyes fixed on the floor. I stepped outside, letting the cool night air wash over me. The door closed softly behind me, the sound echoing down the quiet street. I walked toward my car with a certainty I had not felt in years, knowing that the next move would pull everything into the open, whether my family was ready for it or not. I sat in the car with the engine off, my hands resting loosely on the wheel, waiting for the shaking in my chest to settle. The street outside my parents' home was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels like it is holding its breath. I knew I could not wait long. If I did, I might lose the resolve that had finally taken shape inside me. So I turned the key, backed out of the driveway, and headed toward the only person who could help me put everything into the open. Rachel answered my call on the second ring. I told her I needed to meet Elle again, and that it could not wait. She must have heard something in my voice because she agreed to meet me first thing in the morning. When I hung up, I finally felt the exhaustion pull at my limbs, but there was no room left inside me for rest. Not yet. I spent the night gathering everything. the folder of old documents, Evan's screenshot printed out, the notes I had taken from my conversation with Marjorie. It felt surreal looking at the pieces laid out on my kitchen table. Each one had seemed isolated when I first found it, but now they formed a pattern so clear it felt impossible I had once missed it. In the morning, I returned to Rachel's office. She listened carefully while I described the conversation with my parents, her expression tightening when I mentioned that Sabrina had been the one to show them the so-called evidence. I gave her the printed screenshot. She studied it with a frown, then compared it to the dates and details she had traced earlier. She said the photo supported our timeline. Then she said something else, something that made my breath catch. She said we had enough to request access to Dad's bank communications directly, and that if Sabrina had tampered with anything, the logs would show it. I felt a tremor of fear at the idea of dragging the truth into the open so completely, but I nodded. It was time. Rachel said we should speak to my parents in person again and present everything. She said it was important they understood the weight of the situation before we contacted the bank. I agreed, even though the thought of facing them with the full truth made my stomach tighten. We drove to my parents' house in separate cars. When I parked outside, the morning sun had just begun to burn through the clouds. The house looked the same as always, pale siding, a few weeds near the walkway, the wind chimes by the porch swaying gently. It was strange standing there knowing how much had been hidden behind those walls. Linda opened the door before I knocked. She looked smaller today, like the night had drained something out of her. She stepped aside without asking questions. When I walked into the living room, Dad was already there, perched on the edge of his chair with the stiffness of someone bracing for impact. I told them Rachel was coming in a moment. Linda's face paled slightly, and Dad's jaw clenched. A few seconds later, Rachel stepped through the door. She greeted them politely but with a firmness that settled over the room like a cold draft. Dad looked confused, then uneasy. Rachel sat at the table and motioned for us to join her. I took a seat beside her. Linda and Dad sat opposite us. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Rachel opened the folder and laid each piece of evidence neatly in front of them. She started with the differences in my signatures. She explained calmly that the digital authorization used in 2019 did not match my verified signature from government and employment records. She pointed out the inconsistencies in the curve of the letters and the pressure of the strokes. Dad leaned forward, squinting at the papers, his hands trembling slightly. Then she showed them the record of the IP address used to access the account. Linda pressed a hand to her lips when she heard the location. Dad blinked several times, as if trying to make the information form a picture he could comprehend. Rachel moved next to Evan's screenshot. She set it gently on the table and slid it toward them. The timestamp was clear. The subject line was the same one connected to the unauthorized transaction. The image captured Sabrina at the dining room table, her hand raised as if caught in the act of hiding something. Dad stared at the image for a long time. His face tightened, the muscles in his jaw twitching. Linda let out a soft sound, something between a gasp and a choked breath. Rachel then explained that the financial logs and authorization patterns strongly suggested that someone with access to the home network had repeatedly entered Dad's accounts. She said it was not the type of error that happened by accident. It required intent. Dad looked at her, his voice thin, asking what she was implying. Rachel did not soften her words. She said that based on the evidence, it appeared someone had been manipulating his financial information and attempting to shift the blame onto me. She said she believed it had been going on for years. The room felt like it was shrinking. Dad's eyes were fixed on the table, unmoving. Linda looked at him with a mix of fear and heartbreak. I watched them, waiting for something to change in their faces, some realization breaking through. Dad finally whispered that he had trusted Sabrina. He had believed everything she said. His voice cracked in a way I had never heard. He said he thought he had been protecting himself, protecting the family, and that it never occurred to him she would lie about something so serious. Rachel let the silence settle before speaking again. She said there was one more thing they needed to understand. If the bank uncovered evidence of fraud, there could be consequences far more serious than family tension. Linda's fingers curled against the cushion beside her. Dad leaned back in his chair as if the weight of the truth was too heavy to hold upright. There was a knock at the door then. Soft but unexpected, Dad stood, walked to the entryway, and opened it. The moment he did, A familiar voice drifted into the living room. Grandma Ruth stepped inside, leaning on her cane with determined steps. She nodded at me, then at Rachel, before turning her attention to my parents. Linda asked what she was doing there. Grandma said she had come because she should have spoken up long ago. She stepped closer to the table and said she had something to add. The room stilled around her. She said that a few years ago, Sabrina had approached her about the old family will. She had asked pointed questions about how the estate would be split, about the values of the accounts, about who would inherit what. At first, Grandma thought she was just curious, but then Sabrina made a comment that unsettled her. She said everything would work out if certain people stayed in their place. Grandma's voice did not rise, but it carried the weight of truth. She told my father she had kept silent because she did not want to start conflict. But after the graduation party, she felt she could not stay quiet anymore. Dad sat down heavily, rubbing his temples. For a long moment, he did not speak. Then he looked at me, really looked at me, the way he used to before suspicion clouded everything. His eyes were red, and his voice was hoarse when he said he did not know how he had missed it. I felt a mixture of sorrow and exhaustion and something else I could not yet name. Vindication, maybe, but not the satisfying kind. The truth hurt too much for that. Linda reached for his hand. He let her hold it. His shoulders slumped as if someone had drained the air from him. He whispered that he did not know how to fix what he had done, what he had allowed to happen. The room was quiet except for the faint ticking of the clock on the kitchen wall. I felt the weight of their regret, but also the enormity of the damage. Trust once broken does not return at the same strength. I stood, needing air, needing space. Rachel placed a gentle hand on my arm, steady but silent. I stepped away from the table, the truth still settling in the air around us like dust shaken loose from a long-closed attic. No one followed as I walked toward the door. I paused only long enough to draw a breath before stepping outside into the cool midday light. The sunlight felt sharper once I was outside, as if the air itself had changed. I walked down the driveway slowly, letting each breath stretch a little longer than the last. The neighborhood was quiet, the kind of quiet that settles in after a truth has been dragged into the open. I did not look back at the house. I could not. I kept my eyes on the street ahead, the familiar curve of the sidewalk leading toward a future that felt both heavy and strangely steady beneath my feet. I did not drive anywhere right away. I sat in my car with the window cracked, letting the breeze move through the space as if clearing out the tension that still clung to my skin. My hands rested loosely in my lap. I thought I might cry, but the tears did not come. It was not numbness. It was something closer to acceptance, or maybe the exhaustion that follows acceptance. After a few minutes, I turned toward downtown Boise and drove slowly, not sure where I was going until I pulled into a small coffee shop parking lot near the river. I had been there a few times before, always for quiet mornings when I needed to think. I ordered a cup of tea and carried it outside to a metal table overlooking the water. The river moved steadily, indifferent to everything happening on its banks. I found comfort in that. As I sat there, the events of the past weeks threaded themselves together. The whispers from years ago, the slow shift in my father's eyes, the unease I never named, the neighbor who saw more than she realized, Evan's guilt, Rachel's clarity, Grandma's confession. The truth had been building beneath the surface for far too long, and now that it had broken through, all I could do was face the pieces and decide what to do with them. My phone buzzed. It was a message from Evan. He asked if I was all right. I replied that I was, or at least I would be. He said he was proud of me for confronting everything. That meant more than he probably understood. He carried enough regret for both of us. I told him we would talk soon. Another message came, this time from Linda. She wrote that she understood if I needed time. She said she and Dad were shaken, that they felt blindsided by how deep Sabrina's actions ran. She said they wanted to make things right but did not know how yet. I stared at the screen for a long moment before setting the phone down. I finished my tea and watched the water drift around fallen branches and rocks. The stillness settled into my chest, loosening something I had carried too tightly for years. I gathered my things and walked along the river path, letting my steps fall into a quiet rhythm. For once, I did not feel obligated to rush toward anyone or anything. 2 days passed before I heard from my father. He called in the evening while I was cooking dinner. I let the phone ring twice before answering. His voice was rough, like someone who had rehearsed words but still struggled to speak them. He said he was sorry. He apologized for doubting me, for believing things without asking, for letting the distance grow until it felt permanent. He said he was ashamed. I listened without interrupting. I let him finish every sentence. When he finally grew quiet, I told him I appreciated the apology. I said I understood that he had been manipulated, but the pain he caused was real, and the lost years could not simply be undone. I said trust was not a door that swung back open just because someone asked. It had to be rebuilt, slowly and carefully. He said he knew that. He said he hoped someday I might let him try. When the call ended, I stood in the kitchen with my hands on the counter and let his words settle. The ache was still there, but it no longer felt like it controlled me. It was a part of the past, not the future. The next morning brought an email from Rachel. She said the bank had flagged several irregularities in my father's records, and they were initiating an internal review. She said confidentiality prevented her from sharing details yet, but she wanted me to know the process had begun. My heart tightened, not with fear but with a strange sense of finality. Whatever happened next was out of my hands. It was where it belonged. Later that week, I drove to visit Grandma Ruth. She greeted me at the door with a long look, the kind that holds understanding in it without needing words. We sat in her living room, surrounded by the quiet tick of her old grandfather clock. She held my hand and said she wished she had spoken sooner. I told her I did not blame her. Life is complicated, and families are even more so. She squeezed my hand once and told me I had a strength she admired. I felt myself breathe a little deeper after hearing that. As the days turned into a week, I rebuilt a routine in my apartment. Work at the community college, quiet evenings, long walks at the park. My life felt simple again, but not small. It felt like something I was choosing rather than something I had inherited. I did not see Sabrina during that time. Linda said she had left the house angrily after the confrontation and had not said where she was going. There was an edge of worry in her voice, but also resignation. I did not ask for updates. Whatever path Sabrina was on now was no longer mine to follow. She had made her choices, and I had finally made mine. One evening, about a week after everything broke open, I found myself standing on my apartment balcony, watching the sunset fade behind the foothills. The sky shifted from gold to amber, then to a soft blue that reminded me of quiet childhood evenings long before things grew complicated. I leaned on the railing and let the cool air brush across my face. For the first time in years, my chest felt open, not weighed down by the expectation of keeping everyone afloat. I thought of the girl I used to be, the one who carried responsibilities without complaint, who shrank herself to make room for everyone else. I no longer recognized her, or maybe I finally understood her well enough to let her rest. As night settled, I turned back inside and closed the balcony door gently. The future stretched out ahead of me, not perfect, not predictable, but mine. Thank you for sharing this time with me. If you have ever felt overlooked or misunderstood in your own family, I hope my story helped you feel less alone. If you want to hear more stories like this or continue following my journey, stay with the channel and leave your thoughts. Your voice matters here.